Educational researcher Dr. Jean Clandinin describes narrative inquiry, a research methodology, with this statement. We became attentive to the ways that language shaped the social, cultural, and institutional narratives, and how those narratives, in turn, shaped the individual person. The stories we live and tell are profoundly influenced by the lived and told narratives in which we are embedded. And I love this quotation because in it, Clandinin does not talk about the lives we live, but the stories we live. The lives that are stories, lives that, like a story, have beginning, middle, and end, lives that are inscribed with meaning, symbolism, and ideology, the same way that language and narrative is. Narrative inquiry as a research method assumes that lived experience is a narrative, a story. So the work of narrative inquiry researchers, like Dr. Clandinin, is to pull apart and critically examine the experiences and lives of their research subjects, the same way a literary critic would analyze a poem or novel, looking at the repetition, symbolism, and more to find meaning and insight into the wider world and its systemic issues. However, I believe that narrative inquiry is not just a research methodology. The idea that lived experience is a story, a narrative, is not just an idea. It points us to the beating heart of English language arts, and it is a guiding metaphor for why we study it. When we rethink our personal experiences as narrative, ELA education takes on a whole new purpose: to be the place where students are the narrative inquiry researchers of their own lives. Or put more simply, the purpose of language arts education is for students to learn to make meaning of their own lives. Let's take this in two parts. Part 1, making meaning, and Part 2, of lives. English language arts, arguably more than any other teachable subject area, lends itself to this first vital practice of meaning making. And since this video is about story, I'll show you what I mean with a story. In my Field 1 practicum placement, I was in an elementary school grade 1 class where the teacher was having students take part in the indigenous practice of makopi'it, meaning sit spot. A sit spot is meant to be a place to commune with the land, to reflect and be attuned to your place in the world. That day, the teacher had asked her grade 1 students to answer the question, what does the makopi'it you chose mean to you? They could answer in any way or form that they liked. There were, of course, some macaroni masterpieces, lots of idyllic drawings of butterflies and rainbows that honestly were way more beautiful than the flat, dust-covered school field and parking lot that was actually out there. There was even a pair of students who had both decided to make a list of all of the items in their sit spots. 4 rocks, 5 twigs, 1 big stick, and lots of grass. Because to them, the meaning of a sit spot was about what was in it. But there was one student in particular who had covered his journal in words, written in all sorts of directions in no particular order. Words like rocks, hard, sky, soft, and school, spelled with a K, of course. So I asked him, why did you choose to write your answer? And he looked at me confused. And then he looked over at the purple butterflies that the student next to him had drawn. And then he looked back at me and ever so simply said, because the teacher asked, what does it mean? And then he proceeded to spell out M-E-A-N, mean. I just smiled and walked away, not thinking too hard about it. But as I made my way back to where I was sitting, I realized that for this student, the very purpose of words, the purpose of language, is to make meaning. Alan Luke, remarking on the purpose of English, writes that what is needed is a renewed sense of the purposes and consequences, powers and practices of English, of the intellectual, ideological, and moral force of all forms of representation, and equally a strong sense of English as language, as mode of information, as a multifaceted and ambivalent cultural force. And while this grade 1 student did not know the larger systemic ways in which words are embedded in ideology and culture, he picked up on that renewed sense of purpose that Luke talks about, that language is a multifaceted force, that when words are placed upon things in the world, it has an impact. Words assign significance, voice, and value. This is meaning making. This is the purpose of language. In fact, language lends itself so well to the act of meaning making that without meaning making, language is essentially black lines on a page or incomprehensible sounds in the wind. The purpose of language, then, is for language users to make meaning, and accordingly, the further purpose of English language arts education is for students to learn how to use language. And by that, I really mean for students to learn how to make meaning. And yet, that's not the whole purpose of ELA either. Educating for meaning making is already the work of multiple disciplines, each in their own way, and we still have yet to uncover the of lives portion of how English arts education asks students to make meaning of lives. In the Alberta English Language Arts Program of Studies, Alberta Learning writes that language development is the responsibility of all teachers. For example, subject area teachers teach the specialized languages and forms of each subject. English language arts teachers, however, have a specific role because of their focus on language, its forms, and functions. Note the word choice difference here. How subject area teachers teach specifically the specialized language of their subject, where language arts teachers teach just language, as in the skill of language or language itself. ELA is responsible for teaching students the skill of language, the primal ability to receive signs from out there in the world, whether they be letters or scientific measurements, sounds or numbers, images, color, and more, and to receive those signs and know what to do with them, know how to think through what they signify, know their value and how it applies to themselves and their environments. This finally points us towards how language arts makes meaning specifically of lives. Because yes, on the one hand, meaning making is directly tied to the signs themselves. For example, x plus 2 equals 4 means a specific thing in math. But on the other hand, it only means these things because humans have come together and agreed that x in the math context signifies an unknown number. So ascribing value and meaning to a word, a symbol, a sign, or a structure, ascribing value to anything really is a personal and ideological process. When students use words, when they use the skill of language, they have to think through which words and signs and symbols hold value for them and why. They have to think through who assigned that value to this word and do they agree. They have to choose the ways and the context that they use these words in. Their use of language and how they make meaning is influenced by their very selves, their lives, their experiences, and the systemic social phenomena that have shaped these experiences. And vice versa, their lives are also influenced by the words they use and the words that have been used by others on them. By its very nature, because language is about assigning value, language requires students to make sense of themselves, implicitly and explicitly, subconsciously and intentionally. This is what I mean by saying that the purpose of English language arts is to teach students to make meaning of lives. To finally return to the original quotation by Dr. Clandinin, the stories we live and tell are profoundly influenced by the lived and told narratives in which we are embedded. So I'll leave you with one last story. In grade 10, my English language arts teacher on the first day of class challenged us to come up with a representation of ourselves. The catch was that this representation did not have to be written out in words. It could be anything, a picture, a movie, a math equation, but it was a story because it had to have a beginning, middle, and end. It had to describe who you were, who you are, and who you hoped to be. So, this right here was my assignment. It's a Bildungsromanesque picture book, which is also an allegory about a girl who lives her life staring out the window when she sees a ship pull into the harbor. Now, the actual allegory is not really great, so I won't read it to you, but the book itself isn't the point either. I remember starting this assignment and working for hours and hours and hours well into the night, hoping that when I presented it, I would be that one kid in class that just blows everybody away with their talent, and everybody would be cheering after I read them my book. Needless to say, That's not what happened. There were a few slow claps and one beaming comment from the teacher who could see how hard I had tried. But even that was not the real value of this book to me. I was proud of myself because this was me on a page. Even if nobody else understood the allegory at the time, this was something I could hold on to. As the ship in the story moved back and forth, going out at night and coming back in the morning, beaten and broken, and as the girl in the story watched from her window, this was how I made sense of the seasons in my life. This was me as the narrative inquiry researcher, studying the narrative of my own life, finding placehood and purpose, finding words to describe my loss and my joy, pulling my experiences apart to make meaning of who I was and where I belonged. It was both a history and a prophecy of myself. The moment I finished this assignment and finally realized how precious it was to me, that was the moment where I realized I wanted to become a teacher, to challenge students to make meaning of themselves. To use the words of Alan Luke once again, curriculum in English language arts is about the narrative invention and contestation of identity, about the learning and imagining, weaving and taking apart of Bildung and folk theory, of success and failure, life project and social pathway. So why do we study English? It is no longer enough to just answer that language is powerful or that our world requires the skills of reading and writing. I believe that we study and we teach language arts because language, in all its forms, is inherently how meaning is made. And there is a vital need for students to make sense of themselves in order to do this critical process of making meaning. Language arts challenges and simultaneously frees students to be the researchers of the narratives of their own lives, making meaning of the injustices, the global perspectives, the systemic issues, the emotional peaks and valleys, and so much more that all come with the stories of our lives.